This is Enterprise AI.
It's 12:06 on KUOW 94.9. Time for Week in Review. Here's Bill Radke.
Welcome to Friday. Welcome to Week in Review. Bill Radke here. So glad to be together with you for the next hour where, as we do every Friday, we get together and figure out what happened this week. What does it all mean with our panel of journalists? And this week, that means from the South Seattle Emerald, reporter and co-host of Clapback Culture on Converge Media, Mike Davis. Thanks a lot for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Good to have you here. Crosscut science and environment reporter Hannah Weinberger. Welcome back.
Hi, Bill.
Great to see you. And Kitsap Sun military reporter Josh Farley. Great to have you back again. Thanks.
Good to see you, Bill.
And I mean see, because I can see these folks because we're live streaming this thing on Facebook and YouTube. So listening to us, very, very good. Watching us because we are very attractive people. It's also a great idea. And you can just find us by searching for KUOW Public Radio. Okay, let's get into the big news this week. We're going to start with COVID, and the big news there had two parts, really. Number one, Governor Inslee announced vaccines are required for all school employees. He's already required them for other state employees and healthcare workers. This week it's schools, public schools, private schools, charter schools, higher education, not the students, but anyone who comes in contact with students, teachers, coaches, bus drivers, childcare providers. Unless you get a medical or religious exemption, you've got until October 18th to be fully vaccinated. And that means you're 2 weeks out from your second shot, or you could lose your job. And the governor repeated, this is safe.
Don't necessarily ask for my medical judgment or even Dr. Shah's medical judgment or Dr. Fauci's medical judgment. Go to your physician and ask them about the science of this vaccine. And I am confident that your physician will tell you this is as effective, as safe as anything he or she has ever given you.
Although, to be fair, today's Washington Post tells us, quote, federal health officials are investigating emerging reports that the Moderna vaccine may be associated with a higher risk of a heart condition in younger adults than previously believed. Still, our state's largest teachers union is on board with the vaccine mandate.
This is all designed to ensure that we get off of this COVID roller coaster that we've been on with our schools and having cohorts A's and B's, and schools are open and schools are closed. And we want to make sure that when schools open in the fall, they can remain open.
That's the president of the Washington Education Association, Larry Delaney. Okay, so more on the vaccine mandate in schools in a moment. I just want to give you COVID news number 2, which is that you have to wear masks indoors again, starting Monday. Everybody over age 5, vaccinated or not, unless you have a medical condition that prevents you from wearing a mask, or you're all alone, or you're in a small private indoor gathering or an office not easily accessible to the public, and everyone there is vaccinated. If those things don't apply, you're supposed to mask up. And that includes schools, which some parents do not like. A parent named Kylie Walker helped coordinate more than 100 Unmask Our Kids rallies.
I think that we all know how dangerous COVID is. We all understand that COVID's a thing and that people are getting sick. And I hope that they don't think any parent is against that part of it. It's just our kids, our choice.
Okay, but just don't protest your local school board, says the statewide school superintendent.
Your local school board is not making this decision, whether it's mask or vaccines. This is a requirement of the state of Washington with the power of law in a public health crisis where lives have been lost and will continue to be lost if we don't react. Please take your respectful civil discourse where it belongs, and local school boards are not that place. Let them operate school under the law.
Okay, so that's the COVID update. I'd like to hear from all of you. Hannah, if I could start with you, what are the unions saying about this?
There has been some pushback from unions, including the Washington Federation of State Employees, which has more than 40,000 members. That's a significant number of people. And the concerns tend to align with unemployment assistance. Is there going to be a possibility of benefits for people who separate from their employer for this purpose? Or is the state prepared to handle a possible mass exodus of employees who don't want to handle these new requirements? And I empathize with people who are concerned about being in a precarious employment position. Right now, the state looks like it's going to add people to the queue for unemployment benefit claims. But if you are separating from your employer and it is not the employer's fault for putting you in a precarious position, they followed the protocol correctly, you're probably not going to have a very strong claim. And also, if you do manage to be in a position where your claim is supported, you're still joining, thousands of people who have been in the unemployment benefits claimant line for months. And it can take nearly half a year for your contested claim to be heard by the Office of Administrative Hearings. So, I'm nervous for a lot of people. I do have thoughts about how healthcare workers are going to factor into this.
Yeah.
I
was gonna, if that's actually a good, it's a good segue to Mike, because Mike, you were telling us that's a concern of yours, particularly, is the reaction among healthcare workers.
Yes, absolutely. But before that, I think that I would add on to that just the idea that so many Americans have their healthcare tied to their employment anyway. So if you fire people for not being vaccinated, now not only do they not have employment, they don't even have access to their healthcare. So where does it leave these people who are obviously at the highest risk of catching COVID and having really severe symptoms? But outside of that, when you look at healthcare workers, if you're talking about nurses or anyone who works in hospitals who have been unvaccinated up until this point, why force them to get vaccinated now with the threat of losing their job? Where will it leave the rest of us if we have this mass loss of jobs for people in the healthcare industry? That seems more dangerous than productive at this point.
And I would just jump in and say that meanwhile, the state faces such an enormous pressure to make sure that the school year goes on. Show of hands here, how well did Zoom school go this past year? I think most people would say that it was absolutely terrible.
I'm trying to think of the right hand gesture to give you here.
Exactly. And so, you have that as the backdrop, and, the state, Governor Inslee, they need this basically to kick in yesterday. October 8th, when you say October 18th, you're talking about with the mRNA vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna, you need 5 weeks, if I remember right, or even 6 weeks, I think. You got to get one shot, then you got to get your second shot, and it takes like 2 weeks to kick in. So we're working with a tremendous time pressure to get this done, particularly when it pertains to schools.
Absolutely.
I think it was 3 weeks for me. Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
It was 3 weeks for me as well. But just to go back to the idea of forcing the teachers to get vaccinated, it's just really interesting because the kids can't. If you're a kid under 12, you can't be vaccinated. The school district in Seattle in particular has already backtracked on having virtual options. So, you force teachers to get vaccinated who don't want to get vaccinated and they end up quitting. Well, where does it leave our students then?
Hannah, any thoughts about, we've raised a whole bunch of questions about unions, about essential workers, job loss. What are you thinking? What else should our listeners know?
I think it's hard for me. It gets harder for me to empathize with people who don't want to be vaccinated as the pandemic goes on. I do realize that there are some people who are in medical situations where that's not a possibility. And thankfully, there are still loopholes in regulations that we have where people who do have legitimate medical claims can be exempted, and hopefully their employers will work with them to find safe ways for them to continue to do their work. I also realize that some people have jobs where they don't feel like they can afford to take a day to recover from a vaccine because their employers aren't going to give them that sick day, or they still need to take their kids to school if in-school learning is still happening. This is tangentially related, but I think a lot about healthcare workers just because that's where I've done a lot of reporting. And I feel like if people are worried at this point about a large scale exodus of healthcare workers because of this mandate, there are nursing associations like in Oregon that have put out statements where they're saying, we really need to be concerned about this happening. Like, you haven't been paying attention because nurses, doctors, et cetera, are so burnt out at this point. Like, there are so many other reasons for them to leave. Yes. I think, Josh may have even done some reporting on how overburdened hospitals are right now, not even because of COVID patients, but because it's just so hard to find places for outpatients to go. So I'm really concerned about nurses and doctors for many additional reasons, and we need to have a lot more support for them from the state and from hospital associations.
Yeah, and we're certainly seeing across the state, more and more hospital beds are being filled up, particularly amongst the unvaccinated. You know, we were at about 30 a day a month ago. We're about 100, rolling week average here. Severe nursing shortage definitely is playing into that, no question. The good news, the silver lining here is, of course, not as many people are dying. The treatments are better. Vaccines clearly work, from the data, which is we've all lived the data of seeing that the blunt even of something as contagious as the Delta variant. And the last thing I'll note, because we have talked about kids here, is kids under 12. I interviewed a family, a Bainbridge Island family, a little 15-month-old named Sailor Sumsky. I, of course, couldn't interview her, but her parents participating in a vaccine trial at Seattle Children's. There was some 6,000 people that wanted to be a part of this trial for children to get they're doing the Pfizer vaccine. And at a much lower level dose, of course, for kids at ages like 15 months, but that's coming and that's happening too. So there may be a time, maybe not in too distant future, where we see emergency approval for kids too.
Can I ask about that, Josh? Did this family say they had any different misgivings about giving even a lower dose shot to a baby compared to other people in the family, or was it just a no-brainer for them?
Pretty much a no-brainer. Sailor's mother, JD, she is a nurse, and she believes very much. And as the doctor that's carrying out this research at Seattle Children's pointed out to me, Dr. England, we have 400 million plus doses that have been administered. It is a lower level, but as a family, they talked about it, and that certainly is something to think about. But they decided to go for it.
Mm-hmm. How's the social media treating that family?
Good question. So certainly, there's people that have pushed back on social media. Everyone has a right to their opinion, but also a lot of people, obviously, they viewed it as nothing short of kind of winning the lottery. You have 100 spots for 100 kids, more than 5,000 people wanting to participate. And I will add this, we live in a state where 71.5%, according to Washington State Department of Health, have initiated vaccination. So, you're talking more than we're at 7 in 10 people now.
So they're hoping they didn't get the placebo, that they got
Exactly.
the actual vaccine.
And I will say in January, when it's the study is unblinded, anyone who did get the placebo has the option to get the real
so
thing.
They're in. Yeah. Oh, okay.
They are
interesting.
In. Yeah.
All right. Mike, anything else? Do you feel we covered it? Anything else you think our listeners ought to know for this week on COVID developments?
Just to piggyback again on Hannah's point about doctors and nurses having so many other things to worry about, I think that's the same place we are with teachers. I mean, by and large, it seems like teachers and teachers unions are behind having teachers be vaccinated, but this is just another thing to put on teachers' plates who are overworked and who have been struggling through the pandemic anyway. And so I think that that's just a big thing to stand on. But like Josh said, 7 out of 10 people here who can be vaccinated have already started the process. So it doesn't seem like this is going to be like a catastrophic loss of workers. It's just government stepping in and like enforcing their boundaries and imposing their will on people to put things into their bodies.
Hannah mentioned medical exemptions. There's also a religious exemption. The state school superintendent, at least, said they're not, and I think this is the case for state workers in general. I guess I'm assuming. But the state school superintendent said, we're not going to make you get a signed note from your clergy. If you say you have a religious exemption, then you have one. And I think if you're about to be fired because you don't want this vaccine, I would think it'd be very easy to honestly say that your God doesn't want you to take this shot. I've heard a lot of people tell me that they know what God wants. So I'm curious how that, not philosophical supposedly, but religious exemption is actually going to play out if people are faced with the loss of their jobs. Okay, well, let's pause it there. We'll surely talk about COVID developments next week. And you're listening to Week in Review, by the way. I'm Bill Radke, and I'm here with Crosscut Science and Environment reporter Hannah Weinberger, with Kitsap Sun military reporter Josh Farley, with South Seattle Emerald reporter and the co-host of Clapback Culture on Converge Media, Mike Davis. Before we take a break, I want to get to another an international development that, of course, is a local development to everywhere. You've got the Taliban retaking control of Afghanistan. Thousands of Afghans may be coming to the Puget Sound area. There are several refugee resettlement agencies here. In SeaTac, the leader of Lutheran Community Services Northwest, David Dewey, says that they are helping people who qualify for a special immigrant visa because they've assisted the U.S. in some way.
They've helped the U.S. military or friends of the U.S., and so they don't feel safe. For obvious reasons, they just feel like they're going to be retaliated against. So for fear of safety, they need to flee.
Dewey says whether more families make it here will depend on whether they can find a ride on a military plane, an American plane, or a flight from a neighboring country. The Taliban have shut down commercial flights out of Afghanistan. In King County, the senior director of Afghan Health Initiative, Ariana Anjaz, is expecting 2,000 families to resettle here in the coming weeks.
Many of our refugees coming into the area, they have mixed feelings about coming here. The first being that, they've left their families behind, but they're also thankful that they have brought themselves to safety.
She says some of these refugees fled Afghanistan with just the clothes on their backs. Mike Davis, what questions do you have about how this refugee resettlement is going to work in Washington?
I think the major question that I have is where? I mean, we're already facing a shortage of housing for folks in our region. I think that welcoming these refugees in is absolutely the right thing to do. I just think with everything going on, topics that we're going to discuss later on this very show, where are we going to put them?
Yeah. Anyone else?
I'm a little concerned about the capacity of nonprofits here to be able to resettle people and to help them not only find a place, but thrive when they do. A lot of these nonprofits do so much work already every year, and they only have the capacity to work with a couple hundred people. If we're facing 2,000 people coming into this region, it's going to be a big haul to find, communities for them to get set up with for mentorship or support, to figure out how to feed them, how to house them, how to get them, employment. So I really hope that members of our community realize it's not just about, taking 2 years to build an ADU to find a place to put someone, but you can drive to the airport right now. You can help with meal support. This is not the time for the Seattle freeze. We do have organizations here that help, but it's incumbent upon us to do our part too.
And by the way, if you think of this as refugee resettlement being some sort of Seattle-ish or progressive cause, I don't know if you noticed that there's been really a bipartisan show of support and welcoming of these refugees from the Republican leaders in both the House and Senate. I don't know about county by county, but I saw the Pierce County Council passed a resolution welcoming refugees. They were citing the long history of welcoming refugees, like supporting Vietnamese and Cambodian refugees in the 70s. So the politics didn't fall along that a divide that seems to become so typical.
And I would also add too, I echo Hannah and Mike, but also, we're in the acute phase of this crisis. Clearly, there are still Americans. We just heard from the president about Americans coming home. We're there. We've gotten only that far. But you're right. There has been bipartisan sentiment as well in terms of resettling.
And Josh, you are the military reporter at the Kitsap Sun. There's obviously this is a military story among many other things, and there's a connection to Joint Base Lewis McChord.
There absolutely is. I mean, I don't need to tell you, anytime you drive I-5 through the Tacoma area, you often see planes that look like they're almost just suspended in air over the freeway, right? Well, that's these planes that we saw, these awful, harrowing images. It's called the C-17 Globemasters, built by Boeing. Its nickname is the Moose. There's I want to say there's more than 220 of them in the entire in our armed forces. roughly 40, a little more than 40, I believe, are at JBLM. The reason that they are really effective at airlifts is because they can pretty much take off and land on a postage stamp. For really powerful engines, they can hold 585,000 pounds upon takeoff. They can land on a runway as short as 3,500 feet. You might remember, might remember a C-17 was entrusted with moving Keiko, the whale that played Free Willy, moved from the Oregon coast when he went back to the wild off in the waters off of Iceland. So they're pretty amazing aircraft. And from what I'm hearing, what I'm reading, it certainly seems as if, the pilots and the crews, this is their critical time to do what they do. And the Pentagon wants up to 9,000 people each day out of Afghanistan. There was an image I know posted on social media that showed, I think, 640 people on one of these aircraft. By the way, there's only one toilet on a C-17. So it's not ideal, but they're getting people out. And I know from some other reading I did, Kabul as an international airport where it sits in a valley. Obviously it's really hot. It's also 6,000 feet above sea level. So you've got less dense air, very thin air. It makes it hard on these planes. Oh, and by the way, there's a siege going on all around you with potential weapons fire. So we of course saw this very tragic situation where, according to the New York Times reporting, not only people clung to the plane, but they also, it sounds like, may have been killed when in the wheel wells when the landing gear retracted upon leaving. There's an investigation that we'll see where that goes, but it's certainly just a deeply troubling scene to watch this and this whole crisis unfold before our eyes. But we do have very much a local element, indeed, a plane that is doing some incredibly valiant work, I think, in helping get through the crisis.
Any questions for our military reporter, or just anything to add on Afghan resettlement? Feel we covered it for now, team?
Yeah,
So,
I think, go for it, Mike.
No, go ahead.
It's hard for me as somebody who's been thinking almost exclusively about COVID for 18 months to see photos of people in a plane like that. I realize that is not the most immediate threat to life and limb for these people, but I really do hope that cities, counties around the country are planning on ways to help people, get rapid tested, help people find vaccinations once they get here, if that's something that they're willing to do, or try to do some sort of positive interviewing with them to try to get them on board with vaccination, just to help make sure that these people, if they go through the effort of getting to the United States, that they don't get here and immediately have a medical crisis.
I absolutely agree. And I was actually going to ask Josh, as the military reporter, if he had any background info on that. I had read before my show last night that there had been recently an outbreak of COVID at the U.S. Embassy. So a lot of those people who are trying to get to the airport may have also already been exposed. And in the clip that we played here, President Biden said that he guaranteed transport to the airport. But in reports that I read yesterday, the U.S. Embassy had said that they couldn't guarantee safe passage to the airport. And for people who are not already in the capital city who need to actually get there to get out, how are they supposed to get there? And I just want to know, Josh, if you had any more information on any of those situations. I don't. And it sounds absolutely horrible for those folks. Just addressing the COVID part of this. The one good thing is when they reach our shores, of course, we have testing supplies, and we certainly have ample supplies of vaccine. That's good. Wish I had more to offer you, but it's an emerging story that we're obviously keeping our eye on. I think we're going to see a lot more reporting in the days ahead.
Mike, have you heard anything from the Afghan community in South King County? I know that's where we tend to see most of people from that population, which I'm really grateful that at least there are people here who already have that experience that refugees can connect with.
Right. And at this time, I have not, but that is my plan. I mean, I think you spoke already to all of the nonprofits we have here that are doing the work. Well, because they already have that community of folks here, it is interesting to see not only what they're doing, but how we can all support them in that work to help these people. So at this time, no, but in the near future, that will emerge.
Mike Davis is with the South Seattle Emerald and Converge Media. We've got Hannah Weinberger here from Crosscut and Josh Farley from the Kitsap Sun. And as we mentioned, the housing will be an issue. It's already an issue. It'll be an issue for new people coming here. And we are going to touch on housing solutions and controversies and more when we come back and continue telling you what happened this week and what it all means. I'm Bill Radke. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Support for KUOW comes from Valentine Roofing, whose inspections show that 90% of Northwest roofs need replacement at 17 to 22 years old. Valentine Roofing reminds homeowners to always get 3 bids for home improvement work. More on roof replacements, windows, and gutters can be found at valentineroof.com.
Hey KUOW listeners, this is Patricia Murphy. I'm so excited to celebrate National Radio Day with you. It's humbling to be part of such a long-standing tradition, and we want to continue to be there for future generations. The only way that's possible is if people like you choose to sustain this important service with a monthly contribution. Become a monthly member at any level and ensure our communities have access to this vital resource. Visit KUOW.org/radio. And thanks.
12:32 now on KUOW 94.9 and more of Week in Review. There's Bill Radke.
I look on YouTube or Facebook. I search KUOW Public Radio, and I can see Josh Farley and Hannah Weinberger and Mike Davis because we're live streaming the show. I hope you can join us. Continuing now with the Week in Review. This week, the Seattle City Council passed new restrictions on police crowd control tactics, as KUOW reporter Casey Martin told us.
Last summer, after Seattle police used tear gas, blast balls, and more on protesters, the council banned those less than lethal weapons. But a federal judge stopped the ban from taking effect. Now the council has passed a new ordinance that they think will be approved by the feds. Bill's sponsor, Lisa Herbold, says certain weapons like pepper ball launchers can only be used if there's a threat of violence.
The purpose isn't to move people, but is intended to mitigate or limit the likelihood that somebody is seriously hurt in a crowd.
Mike Davis, you called this new legislation a compromise and a weak one. Will you fill us in on what happened there?
Well, I mean, the original legislation really just stopped police from being able to use all of these harmful weapons on protesters. They call them less than lethal, but if you were anywhere near the front lines, that language is extremely misleading to anyone who doesn't have that experience. And I understand with the consent decree how that got pushed back on, but this new legislation just leaves so many loopholes and so many gray areas for the police to really be able to do what they wanted to do the whole time. And when we're in a city with the police department who had, like, for an example, a direct order to not cover their badge number during protests. And then when you're out on the front lines and you see all the police are just still covering their badge numbers, it's like they already have shown that they won't take direct orders. They've already shown that there's a severe lack of accountability within the police department. So when you put forth this type of legislation that has all of these obvious loopholes where they can still use all of these weapons in these special circumstances, it just feels like the police will do whatever they want.
So police can use tear gas and pepper ball launchers if there's the threat of violence?
That the language is if there is, and I have my notes right here, a violent disturbance. So it's like when you have a protest, I mean, last time they had a protest, we had a situation where the police posted pictures of a potential bomb that turned out to be a candle. Well, if you can mistake a candle for a bomb, then I don't understand what you mean with that disturbance. And then when it comes to like using rubber bullets, for example, Lisa Herbold says that folks wanted that option to remain in case there was a fear that property will be damaged. Well, every time there's a protest, the police fear that property can't be damaged. So really, if you have a large crowd of people marching up a street, well, now police can just use rubber bullets because they can say that they fear that there was this damage. It also leaves loopholes to like who can decide when to use pepper spray, for example. And if you're saying a police officer who has been trained in the last 12 months, that's all it takes to decide. I mean, when those calls get made, the public won't even know who makes the call. We still don't know who made the call at the East Precinct. So it's just really tough when you have all of these openings for the Seattle Police Department in particular, because of the history that we have with them and the way that they seem to skirt all accountability and rules and direct orders.
But Mike, one more question for Mike, if I can, because you brought up something important. Isn't this not the city's call anymore because of the consent decree? The U.S. Justice Department rules about what the city and the police department can do?
Well, yes, that is true. Under the consent decree, they do have the final say. And that's exactly what we just saw with the legislation from Sawant, where they said if they can't use all of these, then it could actually lead to more lethal force. Now, whether that's true or not is open for debate. But yes, the judge does have the power to supersede all of these rulings. So even this right here, we don't know if it's going to go forward or not at this point.
Yeah, I was curious about that too, Mike, that it seems like it's a highly subjective, kind of finding that they would make in what can be a chaotic situation. And isn't there always kind of that way to say that it's dangerous no matter what happens? I am curious to know from you though, on since you've been following this, does law enforcement, if this holds up, if this holds water, will they have to argue for at least for that justification more forcefully now? Will they have to document it in a different way with this, or does it not really make any kind of a change?
Well, that's always not very clear when you're talking about the Seattle Police Department, because things that they should do doesn't always align with the things that they will actually do. I mean, there's so many committees and so much oversight of the Seattle Police Department, but so often there's things that we see right on camera, like a kid getting pepper sprayed in the face, where you just don't see any repercussion, or it gets elevated and then absolutely nothing happens. So that's a great question. I just don't know how to answer it.
Yeah, those are really great points, you guys. And on the topic of what happens when you've been assaulted by police, I'm really glad to see that there's a component of this bill that seemingly gives people a pathway for legal action when they're assaulted by police using these measures. But like Mike said, it remains to be seen what actually happens from that. And, in this conversation, to tie everything back to COVID, I think a lot about how the decisions that we make subjectively affect everyone around us. And mentioning that you can have a member of the police force who's been on the force for 12 months making decisions about when a violent action is happening and when to use these, pseudo military crowd control measures can leave lingering impacts. A lot of people who live in areas where protests happened ended up finding that the environment in which they live is permeated by chemicals for weeks after this. A lot of protesters who were nonviolent were concerned about medical issues that they experienced, and they're still not sure whether being around some of these crowd control measures may have affected things like their fertility. So I think when we talk about, who has the ability to make some of these decisions, we need to be really cognizant of the fact that people who may not even be involved with what a policeman or a policewoman or police person thinks it qualifies as a violent engagement are going to be caught in some of these indirect impacts.
You're absolutely right. And sometimes in these situations, I think it's easy for us to kind of look at it like, well, this situation is over there, or this is going to happen over there. When we're talking about these protests, this happened on Capitol Hill. This happened in people's neighborhoods. There was a really infamous call that came in to city council during public comment of a guy who talked about his infant baby breathing in pepper spray and foaming at the mouth. I mean, he wasn't protesting. He wasn't in the streets. He was literally just sitting in his home. So we're talking about neighborhoods right now. We're talking about families. We're talking about people being affected, whether they're protesters or not. It seems like this would have been a way more serious issue, and that the SPD would have put more effort towards keeping the peace. But sometimes you have situations where they might exacerbate what's going on the streets. And now this is a violent situation. And now the door is open for them to still use pepper spray. So this new legislation doesn't make me as a citizen feel any safer. I think the piece that Hannah mentioned about having an option for people who are a victim of these things, being able to sue, maybe that'll help. But at the end of the day, if there is a lawsuit, that's just taxpayer dollars anyway. It's not like the Seattle Police Department is going to have to foot that bill. It's going to be citizens like you and me that are going to pay for that malfeasance anyway.
We've been telling you about new legislation passed this week by the Seattle City Council after passing legislation last year that did not fly with the judge. Of course, the U.S. Justice Department consent decree hovers over all of this. And so the DOJ is going to review these restrictions before they can be implemented. So we'll keep following that for you. We've got Mike Davis here from South Seattle Emerald and Converge Media, Hannah Weinberger of Crosscut, and Josh Farley from the Kitsap Sun. People in suburban King County will often criticize Seattle for its many homeless encampments. And so King County will say, okay, let's create more housing options and take the pressure off Seattle. For example, King County plans to house some folks in a former Silver Cloud Inn in Redmond. And this week, protesters packed a Redmond City Council meeting to oppose that idea. A coalition of neighbors and business owners say they're worried about crime and drug use. Local martial arts school owner Rachel Wong told Como TV she's worried Redmond could turn into Seattle.
If homeless come here, it will be dangerous for us to go everywhere. Seattle around Seattle, so bad.
And Jessica McMorrow-Stefanoff told Como she wants to know more about what happens after the shelter opens.
Maybe the facility can help some people, but there's always going to be some folks that aren't a success story. So what then happens? If they're kicked out of that facility, are they going to be parking in my driveway?
Mike Davis, I'd like to start with you because you led a panel discussion with journalists on the politics of homelessness that aired on Converge Media. What should our listeners know about this situation in Redmond and others around King County?
Well, it is the county's say on whether or not this hotel becomes a homeless shelter. The fact that they allow public comment, good on them for hearing from people, but the people don't really have the power to stop this. What I find interesting, though, is that a lot of times in communities, you have a lot of residents who are against homeless encampments or against allowing people to set up camps in parks. But you can't be against that and then also be against the county providing a hotel. I mean, homeless people who are unhoused deserve a place to live just like everyone else. You can't say you don't want them in the parks and on the streets and you don't want them in hotels. So it's just really interesting to me that so many citizens they just want the unhoused people to evaporate? They have to go somewhere. This seems like a viable short-term option. Long-term, not so much, but in the short term, this seems like a feasible idea.
Don't the people who live in that area didn't I don't know where the situations are similar and different, but at the Red Lion in Renton, people there complained about crimes and drug use and linked the homeless shelter conversion from the Red Lion, and folks basically got evicted from there. So who has the ability to do what going forward here in Redmond, Mike?
Well, again, the county gets to decide if the people are there. The Redmond elected officials, the Redmond citizens, this is kind of out of their hands. I will also say, though, that those type of reports come from everywhere where you see the unhoused folks living in congregations or like many people at one time. What we don't typically see is any hard evidence that any of those claims are true. So if evidence is presented, of course, we're going to receive it. But a lot of times it's just hearsay and people having the stigma against the homeless. And as far as the claims of like these towns on the outskirts or these other cities not wanting them to be Seattle, well, the reason why Seattle is the way it is because Seattle just ends up being so welcoming. I remember in Auburn where they decided that people living in tents was an actual crime and not like a misdemeanor. Like they really wanted to take people to jail for being homeless. Well, if you make homelessness a crime in your city, of course the homeless are going to have to come to Seattle. And that's how that problem is created. And I don't want to tell people who to vote for, but I will say that Joe Wynn has a much better plan than what I've seen from Dow Constantine, if only just from the perspective of bringing all of those cities back together. I mean, there were like 8 cities that decided to divert their taxes away from the county and not support the county's regional effort to approach homelessness. And Joe really wants to go back to bringing everybody together and actually having a regional approach that will re-include all 8 of those cities. And I think that that's a better idea because we really are all in this together.
Speaking of which, Josh, a regional approach, is this, how do you, what are your notes on this in the Kitsap area?
Oh, well, it's kind of, I mean, there's certainly echoes over here that I hate to keep using the crisis word, but we would call this a crisis as well. I think in our country and within the Puget Sound region and in Kitsap County too. One thing that I have to say about Dow Constantine and about King County, I think they found, according to the Seattle Times reporting, a more rapid way of housing for the unhoused. You got 800 units, a point in time count. I think in 2020, Seattle Times reported 3,300. There's probably more. So when you look at it through just the lens of those simple mathematics, there's we still just have so many more people than housing available for them. In Kitsap County, we are on the cusp of opening in the next couple of years what's become known as Pendleton Place. Many of our listeners here might recognize that name, Lloyd Pendleton, who in Utah, really pushed forward the idea of housing first, which is germane to our topic that we're talking about right now. In a housing first model, before you can really take care of those underlying things, whether it's chemical dependency, whether it's mental illness, what have you, got to put a roof over people's heads. So a 72 bed facility for those the hardest to house in Bremerton is going to be opening just off the highway. The main highway here through Kitsap County in the next couple of years. I think that's part of this in Seattle and in King County, where obviously it's a bigger issue, but that if you can come up with the housing, that seems to be the first step, and from what the legacies of folks like Lloyd Pendleton.
Yeah, absolutely. And to Josh and Mike's points about having more people who need housing than housing available, and when it comes to penalties, I do worry that some mayors who are, allowing these hotel facilities to pop up in their districts are looking at that as an excuse to up penalties for camping on public property, because there will be thousands more people who cannot take advantage of these hotel situations, who then may be subject to increased penalties through no fault of their own. So I think that, as we introduce these facilities, which are stopgap measures, we need to make sure that we're protecting people who can't take advantage of them. And maybe even thinking about this as from a selfish perspective, it's good to give people housing. If you're concerned about your kids being exposed to hard drugs, these facilities will have people who maybe can compassionately help people, find access to safe spaces to deal with their addictions. Or, if you have people who are living in congregate housing during a pandemic, maybe help them find a place in a hotel where they're not living in a room with 50 people. There are so many reasons why this is good for everyone. And I wish we lived in a place where, we could pass taxes that weren't so regressive. These are being funded by sales taxes that end up burdening people who have the least. But I'm happy for my taxes to go to efforts like this. And I hope that mayors and counties allow these to expand.
I agree with that. And I would also hope that, when you listen to the public comment, especially in what came out of Redmond, they leaned so hard on the drug use. And right now, King County's stance, or as it stands on their website, is that they're not stopping people from coming into these facilities because of drugs. And in fact, they're allowing drug use in individual units. Well, when you look at the encampments and the way that people have refused sometimes to take shelters as a service. Well, one of the reasons that you'll hear if you go talk to these people is they won't let me take my personal possessions. They won't let me take my pet. And they have really, really rigorous rules on drugs and alcohol. The step to allow people to use drugs in those hotel units, that's a step towards actually having people accept the shelter that we're offering and getting them out of the streets, getting them out of your parks, and putting them in a place where they can actually live and thrive and be themselves. So I think that that's important, and you can't allow the public to push back on that, because then the public is fighting against themselves.
You're listening to Mike Davis from Converge Media and the South Seattle Emerald, and Josh Farley from the Kitsap Sun, and Hannah Weinberger of Crosscut. And we're going to take a short break and then swat some annoying critters when we return on Week in Review. But I still want you to come back. I still want you to stay.
There may be only one thing better than listening to KUOW.
And that's showing your passion for public radio by working for KUOW.
Right now, we're hiring for a number of staff positions, all listed on our website. KUOW believes attracting and supporting a diverse staff
is crucial to serving the communities where we live and work.
Black and Indigenous people,
people of color, people with disabilities,
veterans, and members of the LGBTQ+ community
are highly encouraged to apply. Get started at KUOW.org/careers.
Support for KUOW comes from the Washington State Department of Licensing. Renewing a driver's license or ID card online can be done from anywhere at any time. Information on how to renew a driver's license or ID card online at dol.wa.gov/renew-and-go.
1252 on KUOW 94.9. Let's return to Week in Review with your host, Bill Radke.
It's so hard to see a mosquito, but it's so easy to see me and Hannah Weinberger and Josh Farley and Mike Davis. It wasn't even a segue. It was like a preview segue. It doesn't yet make sense because I can see us. You can see us because we're on YouTube and Facebook doing Week in Review. Just search for KUOW Public Radio. Okay, mosquitoes. Hannah, we've been talking all summer about the new normal here. Are we going to stop looking forward to summer, right? Our summer's going to be too hot and smoky and on fire? You're working on a story for Crosscut, chipping away at another perk of living here, which is that we don't have a lot of mosquitoes.
You know, Bill, increasingly, a lot of the reasons why I moved to Seattle are slowly falling away.
Yeah.
But, you know, one of the issues that we do experience in August and September is that we may be for a couple weeks of the year aware of mosquitoes. Places like Seattle don't seem to have a lot of mosquitoes relative to the rest of the country. And in fact, we do have much fewer of them than they do out on the east side of the state. But we do have mosquitoes here, and some of the mosquito species, there are at least 52 of them in Washington state, but 2 of them, which carry West Nile, are present in nearly every single county in the state. And one reason why that's concerning is because some studies have looked into the conditions that make mosquitoes happy. So what do they need in order to grow, in order to reproduce more quickly, and in order to want to bite us? And it turns out that as the climate changes, there is a chance that those conditions could be more prevalent for more months of the year. And in fact, there's one study that I saw that found that since the 1980s, Seattle has gained 1 month of mosquito-friendly days. Our temperatures are rising into the range where mosquitoes tend to reproduce the fastest. And that's concerning when it comes to the spread of viruses. So it's something
Hannah,
that we don't have, go for it.
I'm sorry to interrupt. It's just, I think a lot of us are thinking about drought right now, that Washington State has gotten drier. And I definitely think of mosquitoes being around when it's wetter. So what gives?
So that is a crucial factor. Mosquitoes really like it hot and muggy and wet. They need marshland to reproduce. That's where they'll lay their eggs. But on the east side of the state, we have a lot of mosquitoes because we have a lot of irrigation. And counterintuitively, a lot of the researchers that I've spoken with have found that drought can actually be a driving factor in the spread of disease. So if you have early season conditions where we're getting more rainfall in the spring, our snowpack is winding up in our rivers earlier in the year and ramping up mosquito populations. And then you have fewer watering holes for horses and birds and other animals that are reservoirs or hosts of some of these diseases. There's going to be more overlap between some of these mosquito species and those horses and birds. So there's a greater chance where we're going to see our mosquito species that have already had a chance to kind of amplify the virus and their populations, spreading it throughout the year. So be careful, wear non-DEET bug spray, and clean out the eaves of your house. And if you have children who leave toys outside that get water in them, make sure to just turn them over a little bit and limit the places where mosquitoes can live near you.
Can I just say,
yes, Josh, go.
Sorry, Bill. Can I just say, I got to push back just to the point of, I'm a little worried about the murder hornets right now. And I know that they just found another nest up in near Blaine.
Yeah.
I ask this, Hannah, out of love and the fact that I'm curious if this is like super pressing right now issue. I totally agree. You leave standing water, there's things that we can all do, but how much should I panic, a la panic, since we live in an age of panic about mosquitoes?
Don't panic right now. This is something where researchers are only starting to integrate our climate change research and our pest management research, because this is something that we expect to be a concern. So right now, don't worry about going outside and immediately getting West Nile, but we have to start thinking about this now, because our mosquito control districts, which help our public health agencies, are pretty few in number, and our public health agencies are otherwise occupied right now. So there have been studies that have found that they are, under-resourced, and they don't have the necessary protocols and equipment in place to manage mosquitoes if they do become a problem. And guess what? We also don't really know what's up with mosquitoes right now, because we don't have enough people doing monitoring. So there's a chance that a problem could arise and we don't even know about it until it's too late. So
okay,
I
folks,
definitely agree with you.
And don't panic. We have like a minute left, and now I desperately need something to smile about. This is how we end the show. Anybody want to nominate anything smile worthy before we say farewell?
Hannah just made me panic. Can we smile?
It's the way she said "don't panic" that made me feel panicky.
And then there's not enough scientists doing the research.
No, and don't panic about the hornets, because we have so many people, thousands of people who've been helping the Washington State Department of Agriculture track and monitor these things. The reason that we found this nest is because people are keeping an eye on their properties and their neighborhoods. So the more that we are aware of things like this, the less reason we have to panic. So if we start being vigilant now, fewer reasons to panic later.
Well, thank you for the panic smile. We are out of time. That is Crosscut science and environment reporter Hannah Weinberger inventing the panic smile. And I hope copywriting it. I hope you've just trademarked it and never have to work again, although don't stop writing it Crosscut. South Seattle Emerald reporter, co-host of Clapback Culture on Converge Media, Mike Davis, Kitsap Sun military reporter, Josh Farley. It's great to see all of you. Thank you so much for doing the show today.
Thank you, Bill.
The show is produced by Sarah Leibovitz and Alec Cowan, social media and live streaming by Juan Pablo Chiquiza and Tio Popescu. I'm Bill Radke. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and let's do this again in a week.